Hey everyone, it's Sophie. Thank you for listening to this new video, or watching this new video in my new series here on this channel. If you've watched any of my older videos, you will see that they are primarily, if not all, my dance work. So I am a performance artist working in dance, poetry, and some short fiction, but all of my work centers really around horror. So for this beginning of my exploration into the laboratory of the strange, I would really like to start by talking about what it's like to be a woman in horror. Since I've sort of decided that horror was really the genre and the method that I wanted to make work in, I've experienced a lot of mixed reactions. Everything from being told that horror isn't a high art form, it doesn't really gather a lot of intellectual thought, that it's a pigeonhole that I've put myself in, that it's too dark, that it would obviously lead to mental illness and all sorts of negative responses. I actually found myself digging my heels in a lot more in the last few years. I've done lots of research into horror theory. I hope you can hear the quote unquote air fingers in my voice. And I personally really love horror as a form of expression. For me, it's really given me a lot of comfort while dealing with things like OCD and marginalization due to poverty and queerness. So I find that when people tell me that horror isn't the genre I should be making art in, I tend to lash out with the response that I think horror is an incredibly important genre, especially what we've seen in film and with some very specific works of literature. So I honestly think that horror might be one of, if not the most important genre of art, because at its core, horror is about what we as humans are afraid of. So I've been working in horror for a few years now. I've grown up with lots of spooky influences. My father is a huge horror fan, primarily Stephen King, and would actually read me Stephen King and Edgar Allan Poe as bedtime stories. I think one of my earliest being scared memories is watching Tim Burton's Mars Attacks, which upon rewatching is a pretty silly film, but scared me so bad that when I was, 3 or 4, I had escape plans in my house to figure out how to get away if the aliens from Mars Attacks showed up at my door. Horror at its core is what we as humans are afraid of. Whether it's Stephen King's theory that the alien invasion films of the 1950s were America's way of dealing with the Red Scare, or if German expressionism, such as Nosferatu, were representations of Germany's anxiety due to the growing economic depression that they were living in, directly following World War I. As a queer woman, I've really gravitated towards body horror in all sorts of gross ways, not just something like Saw or Cabin Fever, which has been very thoughtfully dubbed torture porn, but also things like John Carpenter's The Thing, and even Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which I'll go more into detail about my love for later in this video. The second category I would label degradation body horror. So that would be along the lines of Saw, something where the human body is being destroyed. Something like The Exorcist could be a great example for both transformational as well as degradation body horror. We see Regan go from this young, sweet girl into this malevolent, inhuman creature. And that would be the transformation. But through her transformation, she engages in self-harm, like the crucifix scene, which I would definitely say would go into the degradation category of body horror. I would even qualify such films as Alex Garland's Ex Machina, which is a great film, which I hope I get to talk about more on this channel, as a form of body horror. I would call it more transformational in the way that it's very much a modern Frankenstein. Again, I'll go into that deeper later in this channel. My more recent work has focused much more on the archetypes of femininity, especially the archetype of the witch. And that, for me, is both very near and dear to my heart as a feminist and as someone in love with horror, because the archetype of the witch really gives a lot of bodily autonomy to a woman, or anyone, honestly. I'm not here to gender what a witch can and cannot be. But she also takes a lot of that bodily autonomy away when we look at various witch trials. And reclaiming that as an archetype has been very strong and has a very interesting lineage in modern horror. I could go on for literally years about my own work and the work that I love, but I'm going to go with the second one, with the latter. So I want to talk about 4 women that I find really inspirational in the genre of horror. The first being, of course, Mary Shelley. So Mary Shelley was born in 1797 on August 30th. Her mother died in childbirth, and her father raised her in a very intellectually stimulating world where she was expected to be as great as her mother. She left at a young age to marry her poet husband, Shelley, Percy Bysshe Shelley? I don't actually know how to pronounce that. And her most famous work is obviously Frankenstein. Frankenstein the novel is incredibly difficult to read. It's dense, it's slow, and the monster itself is not as grotesque as we have been led to believe in modern adaptations. He speaks mostly in poetry and lyrical prose. I love this novel, especially when compared to the work of her husband, who was really talking about how man was coming into an enlightened golden age. And Mary Shelley really took the opposite route, and her 2 most famous novels being Frankenstein and The Last Man, which is one of the earliest post-apocalyptic novels, really talk about the hubris of humanity, especially of men, leading to our downfall. So that, in essence, is very interesting, especially thinking about the fact that she was writing in the Romantic era, when beauty reigned and enlightenment reigned. She really brought, in her own mind and in her own work, to the forefront the problem with human and mankind's hubris. And I mean, we can also talk about how her work was shunned by most of her community and society for being against God in a lot of ways. I personally really love Mary Shelley because I think she has a very interesting life story that doesn't really lead to horror in a very typical way. Until you really look at the deeper psychology of her life, which I could honestly do an entire episode on. She lost multiple children in their infancy. Her husband was he was an unfaithful man and a very needy man that she couldn't always give her fullest to and felt very jealous of. And her society really turned against her when she married him. He was married while they were courting, and so their relationship was incredibly scandalous. Also, her mother was one of the earliest Western white feminists, Mary Wollstonecraft, and her work really reflected on Mary as she grew up, which I think is super interesting, that a woman she never met really helped to define her life, pretty much from beginning to end. The next author that I want to talk about is Octavia E. Butler, more for her actual work than for her life, mainly because I don't know a terrible amount about her personal life, which is on me more than anyone else. So Octavia E. Butler didn't really write a lot of traditional horror. She wrote urban fantasy. Her Pattern Master series is probably her most well-known, next to Kindred, which has been adapted into many different forms. If you haven't read Butler, I would say turn this video off right now, buy one of her novels, and just sit down and read it. They're some of the best writing I've read in urban fantasy, period. But in regards to horror, she has one book that I would qualify as akin to horror, which is Fledgling, her last novel, which is about a vampire who has been genetically engineered to be black. And she faces both racism in the form of her vampire community, thinking that she is an abomination, as well as racism that happens in everyday life in America. Fledgling goes into the struggles that this main character has within her own community and the violence that happens to her, alongside images of her feeding off of symbicants, who are humans that have an emotional and physical relationship within these vampire communities. And so there is an element of traditional vampire and body horror within this narrative of racism that I find to be incredibly well woven together in ways that I just don't see white writers doing. In her other works, especially in her Pattern Master series, she deals with both racism and queerness in really beautiful and interesting ways. The first novel follows a woman who can change her body into basically anything she wants. So she both mothers and fathers children and survives through hundreds of years. So we see the violence that happens to her body due to motherhood, especially forced motherhood, through a sexual relationship with a demon character who is her only true equal in the novel. And I would say that Wild Seed is the first novel in the Pattern Master series, truly brings anxieties that face a lot of people, especially when looking towards the future, into the forefront of the characters' minds, and makes the reader uncomfortable in a lot of really beautiful ways. And I would say, even though it doesn't fall into traditional horror, it definitely functions in a very similar way. And again, if you haven't read her work, please do. And also, writing as a woman of color, her characters are usually women of color, especially queer women of color, and her work really dives into non-heteronormative kinship patterns that I find riveting and so not, I would say, unique to her work, because she's working in a primarily white male Western genre that isn't very open to non-normative relationships structures. The next author that I want to talk about is Amelia Gray. I pretty much know nothing about her as a human being. I have just read 2 of her compilations of short stories. These short stories could be anywhere from 1 page to 10 pages. They're not terribly long, but they're filled with really grotesque imagery. She has one story called 50 Ways to Eat Your Lover, which functions very similarly to a poem, but the imagery in it is very visceral and painful to listen to, and not to listen to, but to read. She also has stories that are completely fantastical and don't really have anything to do with the world that we live in, but a world that obviously lives in her head. As well as one of my favorite stories is from the perspective of a woman who is realizing that this man she's gotten into a casual encounter with is going to murder her. It's beyond unsettling. Both of her books have made me feel gross, and yet I couldn't stop turning the page. Finally, I want to talk about Pina Bausch. She's a dancer. Obviously, I know lots of other dancers, and I don't really want to talk about Pina Bausch as an inspiration for horror in general. I want to talk about one work that, if you've seen this work and if you've seen any of my dance work, you can definitely tell that there is a very strong influence. Her rendition of The Rite of Spring is truly beautiful and haunting. So The Rite of Spring basically follows a community who is looking for someone to sacrifice to their gods for the upcoming harvest. And Pina Bausch's version really brings to the forefront the fear of each individual in this community. The way that she does this is she creates this rural atmosphere by bringing tons and tons of dirt onto the stage. And then the first thing you see are these women who are in white slips, and their slips look dirty, and they keep covering their eyes with the slips, and their movement is very harsh, and their head is thrust about. And then slowly, after a while, the men of the community enter the dirt-covered stage, and they're carrying a red dress. And this red dress, you come to realize, represents whoever will be sacrificed. And it's tossed around from woman to woman, and the way that they behave when they have this red dress is just, it's very obvious that they're afraid and they don't want it. And then the woman who it finally ends up with dances with it. She almost, in a way, duets with the red dress. And it's just, to me, a really great example of how fear itself can be a part of especially part of modern dance, which is what I'm primarily trained in. I would love to talk about other dance forms that are more based around the horrors of the body, or horrors that the body can go through, like German expressionist dance and Buto from Japan. But that's beyond the scope of this introduction or introductory video. I feel like there's so much that I've missed in this first introductory video, but I do just want to say thank you for sticking by with my poor audio quality, my poor editing skills. All of this is very new to me, so thank you for dealing with all of it. Also, thank you for dealing with the weirdness that is in my voice right now. I'm still trying to get used to this. Most of my work is pre-scripted, or I don't speak at all. So this is all very new to me. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of the work that I'm going to hopefully start making. Thank you again, and see you next time. Bye!